my participants. There we go, 27 people in so far.
Yeah, I'll wait till you get a few more. Just going to wait a few more seconds while people are joining us. This is great. All right, well, good morning, everyone, and welcome to our second session of our Lunch and Learn webinar series for 2022. My name is Judy Cohen, and I serve as the current president of the International Dyslexia Association Florida branch. On behalf of our entire board, I want to welcome you to this webinar, and thank you for taking time from your Saturday to join us. We want to start with just a few reminders. For those of you who haven't checked our website lately, our vision is that all students in Florida will receive structured literacy instruction provided by effective teachers who understand the science of reading. Recordings and resources from previous sessions from this year and last year are available on our website, and this will be posted in the chat a little bit later, fl.dyslexiaida.org. And we also want to let you know that the PowerPoint and the handouts for this session are available on the website now. So you can click on the link that just popped up in the chat, and you can actually follow along with the PowerPoint, and you'll be able to see the handouts as well. So before we get started, a few housekeeping notes. Everyone is muted, but feel free to use the Q&A to post your questions throughout the session. There will be some time for Q&A after the presentation, and we'll try to answer all your questions. For those of you who are interested in getting a certificate of attendance, you may be able to earn ESC credits towards your 20-hour ESC recertification requirement and earn in-service points toward your required 40 points for the recertification requirement from House Bill 7069. You should check with your individual county's CEU ESC coordinator to determine if this CEU would be accepted. So in order to obtain a certificate of attendance for each webinar, you need to attend the webinar in its entirety, and the webinar must be attended live. Attendance and time spent in session is recorded electronically during the live session. Those who attend a session in its entirety will receive a certificate of attendance approximately 1 to 2 weeks following the webinar. Also, this session is being recorded and will be available in a couple of days on our website. So today's session is Comprehension Strategies That Work, and it will be presented by Lynn Givens. Lynn has been a teacher of struggling readers and a teacher educator for over 40 years. She served as Director of Intervention at the Florida Center for Reading Research, where she was involved in providing intervention training and professional development for teachers throughout Florida. Until recently, she taught undergraduate reading courses at Florida State University's School of Teacher Education and facilitated practicums for teachers of struggling readers. As a staff member at Beacon Educator for 10 years, she acted as instructor facilitator for online teacher endorsement courses in reading. Trained in the Orton-Gillingham approach, she spent 8 years at the Schenck School in Atlanta, which provided her with a firm foundation in teaching students with dyslexia and other struggling readers. Her goal has always been to provide high-quality, explicit instruction to close the gaps for students who are having reading difficulties and to instruct teachers on how to do this as well. She is the developer of the Connect to Comprehension Intervention Program for struggling readers and of the Center for Literacy Learning, which provides essential professional development to all teachers. It is my pleasure to welcome Ms. Lynn Givens.
Thank you, Judy. It's a real pleasure to be here today, and thank you to IDA Florida for sponsoring this and supporting this and letting me share this information. I'm so happy that so many of you have signed up. Today, we're going to be unpacking the critical reading component of comprehension, which, as we all know, is a huge area, but it is the end goal of all reading. We're going to identify 8 essential strategies to help readers become more adept at understanding what they are reading. And this information is important for all readers, but it's critical for our dyslexic students and struggling readers who often need a much more explicit, systematic approach to all reading components, and this includes comprehension. Just a brief note. Oh, one thing about chats, we're going to be turning chats on and off during certain parts of the presentation. And so we're going to be answering your questions, but not all the way through the presentation. So go ahead and record your questions, and we'll stop and take as many of them as we can at several points during the presentation. And then we'll have a long question and answer session at the end to get to a lot of your questions. But go ahead and record them as you're thinking about them as I'm going ahead and presenting. Just briefly, my journey in comprehension began about 35 years ago when, as Judy mentioned, I was a teacher at the Skank School in Atlanta, which is a school for dyslexic learners and is a wonderful place to teach and to learn. I was teaching a group of 6th, 7th, and 8th grade dyslexic, mostly boys. I did this for 8 years, and we were doing a wonderful job, a truly wonderful job of teaching these young people how to read. Many of them were non-readers, even though they were 6th, 7th, and 8th graders. Many of them were non-readers when they actually came to Skank for the first time. So we were doing a wonderful job of helping them learn how to decode and access text. But we weren't doing as much in terms of teaching comprehension. Basically, we were having them read text at their level, and we were asking them questions, sometimes one-on-one. But I remember thinking at the time, and all the way through my time there, we need to be doing more in terms of comprehension, because comprehension is more than just being able to answer specific questions that your teacher asks you. So that began my journey, and I've been doing research into this and doing a lot of deep thinking about it for all of these years. And I'm excited to share with you today a lot of what I've learned. So here we go. Before we start, I always like to start with your assessing your own knowledge so that you can then judge whether this was valuable. I certainly hope it will be, and how much you've learned from this presentation. So you can rate yourself. This is not a test, but just a way to rate yourself. You can start with, 1 being I don't know very much, and 5 being I'm an expert. Can you give a brief description of comprehension? So an elevator speech. You're in the elevator with someone you're going from 1st floor to 5th floor, and somebody says to you, well, what is comprehension? What do you mean by comprehension? Can you give that elevator speech? Can you explain to them what comprehension is? And then can you explain what metacognition is? We're going to be talking a lot about metacognition today and how that relates to comprehension. So ranking yourself, do you have a good understanding of that term? Next, do you know why comprehension is so difficult for our struggling readers? A lot of students who are not struggling readers struggle with comprehension, but our dyslexic students and struggling readers have particular areas of concern that we need to address. Do you know why comprehension is so difficult for these students to achieve? And then the focus of our program today, of our webinar, do you know a variety of metacognitive strategies for helping students understand what they are reading? We talked about asking questions, yes, but there are many other strategies that we can use, for helping students understand what they're reading. And then, if you know those strategies, do you know how to teach them effectively, systematically, with scaffolding to our struggling readers? So take a minute, rate yourself on all of those areas, and then we'll return to this at the end of the presentation. So let's begin our journey with asking the question, what is comprehension? Comprehension is the understanding and interpretation of what is read, being able to extract meaning from what has been decoded. So it goes way beyond decoding. And then to use what has been read for the purpose of thinking. To be able to accurately understand written material, students need to first be able to decode what they've read, 2, make connections between what they are reading and what they already know, and then 3rd, to be able to think deeply about what they have read. So comprehension involves not just reading the words and understanding at a surface level, but being able to think deeply about what has been read. And while we're talking about deep thinking, let's talk about metacognition. So what is metacognition? Well, we've seen this a lot. This is the simplest definition. Metacognition is thinking about one's own thinking. So it's an internal conversation that you're having with yourself as you're reading. Now, proficient readers do this almost automatically as they monitor their own thoughts and understanding while they're reading. You and I do this automatically because we're fluent readers and we don't have the struggles that our dyslexic students have. So a reader uses metacognition when he previews the text and makes predictions. Okay, what is this going to be about? What am I going to learn? What's going to be presented here? When he starts to make connections between his own personal experience and other texts that he's read, when he can ask clarifying questions of himself as he's working through the text. Again, that internal conversation. When he can identify, and this is critical, we're going to talk about this next, but when he can identify difficult sentences or passages and have a way to fix that so that he can move through the information, that he can restate what he's read in his own words, and that he can react to the text. So metacognition is having that conversation with yourself, and this happens before reading, during reading, and after reading. So we know that comprehension is just one of the 5 essential components of reading: phonological awareness, phonics, fluency, vocabulary, and finally comprehension. So how is comprehension connected to all of those other reading components? Well, all of those components play a part in comprehension. Phonemic awareness and phonics lead to more effective automatic reading. But so that if you are having difficulty at the phonological awareness and phonemic level and you have difficulty decoding, you have little cognitive energy left for understanding. So that's how phonics plays and decoding plays a role in comprehension. It can be a real stumbling block, especially for our dyslexic students and other struggling readers. If you are reading word by word rather than in meaningful phrases with appropriate expression, you're going to have a lot of trouble extracting meaning from the text. So word by word reading makes comprehension very difficult. So we have to help our students move beyond that word by word reading and incorporate fluency. We know that vocabulary plays a huge role in comprehension because a failure to understand even a few important words in a text can severely affect understanding. And this, of course, goes back to decoding, because if you have difficulty decoding a word, you're gonna not be able to know what it means, and that's going to further impact comprehension. But here's something that's really, really important to understand and to practice. This does not mean the fact that our struggling readers may struggle with all of these areas. This does not mean that comprehension should wait until other components have been mastered. Helping students understand the meaning of text can happen even before students have learned to read by using interactive read alouds and modeling the types of thinking that are involved in comprehension. And then, as students progress in phonics and fluency, they can begin to read text that they can then read and use the skills that you have modeled. I am a real fan of interactive read alouds. I've used them whenever I've been teaching. The interactive read alouds that I did with my 6th, 7th, and 8th graders were critical in terms of building their understanding of the way that they should be thinking before they became fluent readers. I just a day or so ago read a wonderful presentation, and you can Google this and find it. I didn't have time to put a link on. It's the hidden power of read alouds. The hidden power of read alouds. It was posted by ASCD, and it's a wonderful just description of specific ways that these interactive read alouds can help our students. So comprehension is one of the 5 components, and we've talked about how it's connected to all of those, but how is it different from all of the other components? In terms of comprehension elements are much broader in scope. You never really get to the end of comprehension. When you're teaching phonics, you can say once a student has mastered all of the phonemic elements, you're done. When you are working with fluency, once a student is able to read with appropriate prosody and appropriate rate and appropriate accuracy, you're pretty much done. You don't have to focus so much on fluency. Vocabulary and comprehension are different in that they never end. I am constantly learning new words as I read, and I am constantly improving my understanding as I read more challenging text. So that same thing holds true for all of our students. We will continue to work on comprehension and vocabulary throughout our students' time with us and hope that they're going to do that beyond. In addition to that, students need to be able to master the thinking skills involved in 3 different kinds of comprehension. And we'll talk a little more about this later, but just briefly, literal comprehension, which is the first thing we're working on, is understanding the information that's directly stated in the text. So that who, what, when, where kind of comprehension. Inferential comprehension, the next step, involves making connections within the text and between text. So we're inferring, we're comparing and contrasting, we're thinking about cause and effect. We're making all of those kinds of inferences as we read. And finally, evaluative comprehension, or some people call it critical comprehension, where decisions are made about the author's intent and effectiveness. So in addition to comprehension being broad and ever-changing, there are also these 3 levels that have to be mastered as students read more and more complex text. Now, here's a critical question for those of us who are working with dyslexic students and struggling readers. How does comprehension for struggling readers differ from that for fluent readers? Well, fluent readers automatically decode text, and so they're able to decode and comprehend text at the same time. They can focus on main ideas and important information when they're reading. They can accurately paraphrase that that consistent conversation going on in their heads. They can paraphrase and summarize important information, and this is critical. They can self-monitor when they're reading so that they know when a lack of understanding occurs. And they can organize information that they've learned from their reading. Struggling readers often have a diminished ability in each of these skills because, as we've said, so much of their energy is focused on decoding the words and just getting through the written material. All right, so we talked about what fluent readers do. What happens for comprehension with struggling readers? Well, they often have difficulty recalling the main events in a text. It's not just recalling, but what are the important parts that they need to remember? They often have difficulty sequencing, recalling the sequence that's happening in a story, in a narrative text. They sometimes focus so much on the details, on trying to remember every little thing, that the main ideas are lost. They have difficulty predicting what will happen next. They have difficulty picturing what's going on in a written passage, and we're going to talk about how to help specifically with that as we go through our strategies. They have difficulty providing evidence from text to support their answer. So you ask a student a question and he gives you an answer and you say, show me where you found that. That's very difficult for many of our struggling readers. Informational text poses a lot of additional difficulties beyond narrative text. And we'll talk about the differences about those two and how you can help with each of them later. And we'll have a graphic organizer for informational text and a graphic organizer for narrative text to help you start students on this journey. Again, they have difficulty monitoring their own understanding. So they're reading, the words are just sort of washing over them, and they are not sure when they've understood and when they haven't. And they're unaware of many basic strategies that good readers use automatically. We may not even have taught them, but they just do them as they are reading. And so we need to focus comprehension skills and strategies in a very systematic, explicit, scaffolded way to help our struggling readers address these problems. In addition, while we're teaching these, we need to also be sure that we can teach them, of course, first through our interactive read alouds. But while we're teaching, we need to make sure that our students can access the text. So using decodable readers, as students are learning how to decode, they can still learn to do all of these things if they're able to decode the words in a story, in a passage. I'm a real fan of high noon readers, and we use these all the way through the Connect to Comprehension program, the High Noon Sound Out chapter books, because students are able to read the words. That takes the decoding difficulty aspect out of this. And those particular readers have information that you can use to do all of these things. So High Noon readers, shout out to them. Okay, let's take a minute to reflect on what we've talked about so far. And we'll take a brief minute, Frank, to look at any questions before we move on. So reflect on these questions. How are metacognition and comprehension related? Do you feel comfortable with your understanding of that? What comprehension is, what metacognition is, how those are related? And then really importantly, why do struggling readers need more explicit, scaffolded comprehension instruction? So we'll take your questions now or just your thoughts. Frank, any questions, any thoughts?
Yeah, we do have some questions so far.
Okay.
I'm gonna, there are some that I think might be better for the end or that you might be addressing soon. So
Okay.
I'm gonna kind of cherry pick some of the questions for now.
Sure.
So one of the questions was, I teach small groups as an instructional support teacher. Should we teach the struggling readers how to use metacognition before working on comprehension?
Well, you can do that as you read to them. If you're working with struggling readers, a great way to start is with those interactive read alouds. So yes, you don't want to have to climb. I'll give my 2 mountain speech. You don't want to have to climb 2 mountains. You don't want to have to climb the decoding mountain with them and then start with climbing the comprehension mountain when you can do both of those at the same time. So first work on starting to talk about those metacognitive strategies before you're even reading with students.
Another question is, we had a couple questions about, can you describe what an interactive read aloud would look like? And also there's a question of if you can, I'm going to look up that article that you were discussing and see and try to post that in the chat about the.
Okay, that will be great. Thank you. I just didn't have time.
No worries. So can you give some examples of what an interactive read aloud would look like?
I actually have, and I'll send this to you, Frank, and you can post it as well. I actually have an example of an interactive read aloud that I did with students using The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. And we'll post that so that people can sort of have a view. But just a brief description. While you are reading to students, you are using those metacognitive strategies that we're going to be talking about. You're reading and then you're saying, oh, I got to this word. I don't know what this word means. I better go back and look and see if I can figure it out, and how you do that. And you're also paraphrasing while you read. Oh, so I just read that. So while you are reading with students, you're modeling the kinds of thinking that you're doing so that students can start to see what kind of thinking they should be doing. I hope that helps. And I think when you see the sample and you read the article that Frank has posted, that you'll have a better understanding.
A couple questions. I will post the link to the High Noon books in the chat for everybody. And then another question is, let's see, a couple of questions about assessment. How do you assess? What's the best way to assess students' comprehension? And how do you monitor progress? What do you have any recommendations for progress monitoring?
Well, in the Connect, I thought so long about this and so hard. It's very difficult to do this. And the problem with doing, and I've looked at lots of assessments, the problem with progress monitoring is that you're progress monitoring, but you're not progress monitoring specific skills. So when I wrote the Connect to Comprehension assessment, I made sure that all of the questions, so there are 10 questions at every level, that all the questions were the same. So the first 3 questions are always recall questions. What are 3 things you remember? The 4th question is always a main idea question, and so on and so on and so on. So it's important that you find an assessment that's asking the same kinds of questions. You always want to start with recall, because if students can't remember what they've read, they're not going to be able to do anything else. I don't have any specific recommendations for a good assessment because I've never really found one. That's why I invented my own. But you want to start out, first of all, with something like the core phonics survey. You want to make sure that before you assess comprehension, you're assessing those other components. So you want to start out with a phonics survey, first of all. Then you want to do that comprehension. I would do comprehension with decodable text at a level that students can read, so that you're taking out the decoding aspects of the comprehension and you're just focusing on how well do they understand. But Frank, maybe you can give them a better assessment for comprehension. I struggle with this a lot.
I don't think that there's not a really great assessment. I mean, I think part of the issue that I find is that so many assessments don't use text dependent questions.
Yes.
Does that make sense? So that there's
Yes.
a lot of comprehension assessments that use questions that the student could understand, could know from background knowledge, as opposed to having to have read the text.
Yes.
So that's my biggest issue. I tend to use criterion referenced passages, like the Brigant's comprehensive inventory of basic skills. I sometimes use the gray oral reading test. Depending on the age, if they're older readers, I'll use the gray oral reading test. And then I'll even sometimes use the maze passages from the dynamic indicators of basic literacy skills, the DIBBLE.
Yes. Yes, those are all good. If anybody has wants to see my specific guidelines for what an assessment should include, just shoot me an email and I'll send that to you. Okay, other questions? Or should we move on?
So we talked about assessment. One question is, I'm going to go ahead and review. Why don't you move on, and I'll keep reviewing the questions and try to.
Sounds good. We'll stop again. So if you didn't get your question answered, don't worry. We'll try to answer them in another pause at the end of the session, and I'll provide my email address. You're always free, always, always, always free to write me, and we can have a discussion. Okay, so we're moving on now. We're going to center this part of our discussion around 8 essential metacognitive strategies that students can apply in their reading once you teach them and practice with them. Of course, our struggling readers are going to need more modeling, more structured practice, and more examples. We want to be able to teach these in a logical, explicit manner, each one of these 8, but keep in mind that the main goal is to let students learn these strategies and learn to be flexible in applying them. And we'll talk about that at the end. But we want students not to be hung up on one strategy, but to be able to read a passage, to know what they need to do before they read, during the time that they're reading, and after they're reading, in terms of these 8 strategies. So flexibility is the key here. Okay, here we go into our journey. The first strategy I'm going to talk about is absolutely, in my opinion, the most critical, and that's self-monitoring. Students who are good at monitoring their own comprehension know when they understand what they are reading and when they do not. They can identify what they don't understand, and they have strategies to fix problems in their understanding as the problems arise. Research shows that explicit instruction, even in early grades in this strategy, can help students become better at monitoring their own comprehension. So here's an example. Okay, I'm reading along and I'm aware that I don't understand something. This is a conversation I might have with myself. Oh, I got the idea on the first page, but now I'm confused. Okay, I'm going to identify what I don't understand. I don't understand the second paragraph on this second page. I don't get what the author means when she says, quote, "Arriving in America was a milestone in my grandmother's life." I don't understand that sentence. Okay, I'm going to look back through the text. Oh, I see in the previous paragraph that it says it was important for the grandmother to come to America. Oh, so the author means that coming to America was a very important event in his grandmother's life. So you see, first I had to make sure, I had to be able to know that I didn't understand. I had to pinpoint what I didn't understand. I had to look back to see if I could help. And then I needed to be able to ensure that I then had a full understanding. Okay, so how do we help students be able to do this? Well, we model self-questioning, and we talked about how important that is in our interactive read alouds. If you take a look at what students are going to be reading, and you use little sticky notes with places where students should be checking for their understanding. You can have a specific question there, or you can just have a little sticky note with a question mark. Do you understand what you're reading? And that will cue students in to knowing, okay, I should be stopping to check that I understand. Many of our dyslexic students, many of our struggling readers will read a whole story, a whole passage, and then you say, what did you read? Do you understand what you read? And they just sort of shrug their shoulders. So this alerts them to the fact that they need to be able to stop and check their own understanding. Coding is another strategy that helps students learn to self-monitor. And this is a great way to get students engaged in what they're reading. They can learn how to use a code to mark places in the text that cause confusion or require further information or whatever you want them to be able to do. So they can use an exclamation mark, for example, to identify new ideas or big ideas that are important, that were aha moments for them. They can circle new vocabulary. They can use arrows to show how ideas are related. They can put question marks for things that cause confusion. And like all strategies, this use of sticky notes and particularly coding needs a lot of practice before students actually use this independently. You can do this during, again, your interactive read alouds, or you can do it while you're sitting in small groups working with students. I really like clicks and clunks. In the click to clunk example, the words that students instantaneously understand are called clicks. So it's like a train going down a rail, click, 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 everything's working fine, okay? The words that make no sense to them, either they can't read or they don't understand, are called clunks. So you're clicking along, click, 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 and you clunk. You come to something in the road that's keeping you from going beyond that. So clunks are analysis to potholes in a road that impede the process of smooth driving, or that something on the rail that's keeping your train from moving forward. So to decipher the meaning of these clunks, students need to first determine if the clunk is a decoding difficulty or another kind of difficulty, like a vocabulary difficulty, and use an appropriate fix-up strategy. There's a clicks and clunks graphic organizer in your handouts, which makes a perfect anchor chart for your classroom, to understand that if students can identify what they don't understand, you have strategies in hand they have strategies on hand to help them. Okay, there's our first cognitive strategy, self-monitoring. Looking at our time, thinking we need to move on. Let's take just a minute or two, Frank, for maybe 2 questions about self-monitoring. Can we do that?
Yes, I have a question from Nancy. When starting self-monitoring, how much text should they cover? One sentence or a
That's
paragraph?
a great question. That's a great question. I would start with single sentences. With all of our strategies, you want to start small and build. So 1 sentence to 2 sentences to a short paragraph. Again, decodable text is great for this, especially with our dyslexic students who are having trouble with the decoding part of the reading process. But starting small and building is something that we need all the way through. So great question. Start small, build slowly once you see mastery. Great question. Thank you.
I think that's,
Okay,
see,
ready to move on?
let's see, one. Let's see, what about when passages, text, or testing is on the iPad and students can't physically mark up the text?
I'm not a technology person. So I don't know the kinds of things that they can do.
Right.
I'm
And
sorry, Frank.
in my experience, that's usually something that if a student has been diagnosed with a disability or has ESE services, pencil and paper can be requested as an accommodation for a student
Perfect.
who really needs to be able to mark up a text for comprehension purposes. Or there should be tools available on the device that are available
Yes.
for students with
Yes.
disabilities. So I would insist with your ESE contact person that the child have access to those accommodations.
Perfect. Thank you. Yes, I'm a real paper and pencil fan. I think once we introduce iPads and all that, we run into all kinds of different issues. So paper and pencil when you can. Judy,
May I
did you
just
have a question?
interrupt? Yeah, not a
Yes.
question, but several people have been asking about the handouts in the PowerPoint. So I answered it again on the Q&A, but it's also in the chat. All the handouts and the PowerPoints are at our website, fl.dyslexiaida.org, and that is in the chat for those people who came on a little bit late. So hopefully they can locate it and follow along.
I also
I
just
have one
reposted it.
question, Lynn. If you don't mind me asking this at this point, can you clarify a little bit for our participants the difference between listening comprehension and reading comprehension? Because I
Yes.
think some people are assuming that the students have to be able to read the passage before we can start talking about some of these strategies.
Well, I've
Thank
talked about the interactive read aloud, and
Right,
that
but I wanted to connect that with
and
listening.
that would be listening comprehension. So
Correct.
it's really important that we incorporate listening comprehension into all of this so that we're modeling those strategies with text. We're taking the decoding issue off the table to teach these strategies first through our interactive read alouds, which involve listening comprehension. Does
Thank
that
you.
help, Judy?
Yes, thank you so much.
Okay, sure. Okay, so I'm going to move on. Here's the graphic organizer that you're going to see in your handouts, and it will show you that your click shows that reading is going along smoothly, and then you have various ways to work on your clunks, whether they are a word clunk, where it's actually the word that's not recognized due to decoding issues, or a meaning clunk. And there are three things that you can do under the meaning clunk. So I think this is a great, to me, a great anchor chart for your classroom to remind students that they have ways to help themselves understand and monitor their own comprehension. Okay, so we're not going to stop for you to answer these in a chat, but just think about this again as your self-assessment. What can you do as students are reading to help them self-monitor? And what can you do to prepare a text before students read to help them with this strategy? We've talked about a couple of things that you can do, and you might have some other ideas. So now's the time to sort of think about those and sort of connect all of this information before we move on to our second strategy. Okay, our next strategy involves summarizing. And instruction in summarizing helps students first generate main ideas, okay, and focus only on key details. Not all of the details are key details. So you need to be able to separate out the main ideas and the key details from everything else that's going on in that passage. You need to be able to connect the main idea or central ideas using key words and phrases. This is really hard for our struggling readers. Eliminate all the information that's unnecessary, that you don't need for your summary. And this really helps students remember what they read. You can't remember everything that you read, but if you can summarize, that's so helpful. Struggling readers, when they're asked to summarize, may do a bunch of things, and I've seen all of these happen. They may try to tell you or write down everything because they can't distinguish between the main ideas and key details from all the other details. So they may tell you what color shirt he was wearing, not part of the summarizing. They may try to, they may try to write everything down. They may just sort of look at you and say, I don't know, and not tell you anything and write nothing down. Or they may just copy parts of the text as their summary. So none of those is very helpful, and we need to think of how we can help students learn how to summarize. Okay, as always, we're going to provide modeling and examples. We can do this through our read alouds. We can do it with short passages where we're actually doing the summarizing. It's also really helpful to practice this orally before students do any writing, because our dyslexic students, our other struggling readers, in addition to having reading difficulties at the decoding level, also have encoding difficulties. They have difficulty writing. So doing this orally is very helpful. We're going to model and practice selective highlighting. Many of our students, when you ask them to highlight, just like they'll tell you all the information and not be able to tell main ideas and details, will highlight everything. It's like just coloring the page. So we need to practice selective highlighting and selective underlining. So we can practice going back and forth between writing our summary ideas and checking the highlighting and underlining to make sure that everything has been captured without too much being highlighted and underlined. Students need a lot of practice with this, but again, well worth the practice. We're going to be talking about two specific strategies to help with summarizing. One for informational text, the gist, and one with narrative text, the somebody wanted but so then organizer. So to start with getting the gist, we'll have students list the who, what, when, where, and possibly why and how elements, and then ask them to write a statement that incorporates these elements. And then we'll practice narrowing that statement down to 10 or 20 or 15 or 20 words. And we're going to be practicing this specifically in just a few minutes. The somebody wanted but so then strategy is a great way to teach students how to summarize narrative text. And we'll look at that template as well and do some practicing in just a few minutes. Those are two great ways to practice summarizing. So here's an example with just very specific 5 steps that we can post as an anchor chart in order to help students in a systematic way learn how to summarize. So we want to pick out the important details and highlight them. We want to underline the key words in those details. So we may be highlighting a phrase, but we're going to underline only 1 or 2 of those key words in the phrase. We're going to cross out everything that's not important to our summary or things that are repeated. Then we'll take the keywords and we'll list them in an order and trim the keywords down to 1 or 2 summary sentences. So let's take a look at what that looks like here. Here's a passage, the Northern Lights. There are times when the night sky glows with bands of color. The bands may begin as cloud shapes and then spread into a great arc across the entire sky. They may fall in folds like a curtain drawn across the heavens. The lights usually grow brighter, then suddenly dim. During this time, the sky glows with pale yellow, pink, green, violet, blue, and red. These lights are called the aurora borealis. Some people call them the northern lights. Scientists have been watching them for hundreds of years. They're not quite sure what causes them. In ancient times, people were afraid of the lights. They imagined that they saw fiery dragons in the sky. Some even concluded that the heavens were on fire. So, as I've done with you, I would read the passage with students. Okay. The next thing that I'm going to do is I'm going to highlight. Here I've underlined important detail. So I've got night sky, bands of color. I'm coloring the phrases. Night sky glows with bands of color. These lights are called the aurora borealis. Some people call them the northern lights. Scientists have been watching them, so on and so forth. So I've highlighted all the things that I think are the important details. Now I've gone back and underlined the key words: night sky, bands of color, aurora borealis, northern lights, so on and so forth. I didn't cross out all the rest because then you couldn't see it. But what you would do if you had this passage is cross out everything else that's not important. It's not important they fall in folds like a curtain drawn across the heavens. That's a wonderful description, but it's not important to our summary statement. Okay. I've listed the keywords in order down below, and then I have written a summary statement. So you can sort of see how this works. Again, lots of practice. It's not a perfect, your summary might be a little different than mine. That's okay, as long as I don't have things like they begin as cloud shapes and spread across the, okay. I don't want to focus on details. I want to focus on main ideas and the key details. Again, using decodable text that students can access, really important if you have students for whom decoding is a real issue. You can also use passages like this as long as you make sure to read them with students. Okay, here's the template for our gist, which is another way to help students summarize. People always ask me what gist means. And of course, getting the gist means getting the big picture. But gist actually stands for generating interactions between schemata and text. Okay, you don't have to remember that. There won't be a test. But the goal is to be able to write a summary statement in a given number of words. These number of words can vary depending on the age and skill level of the students and the kinds of text that you're using. But it is a systematic approach that works well for many students, including our struggling readers. Of course, as with all graphic organizers, you want to model using gist with a short passage and then work with students to guide them through the use of the organizer until they are comfortable using the gist template on their own. So let's take a few minutes to practice using this wonderful summarizing tool. You have a gist template in your handouts. If you're not accessing your handouts yet, you can just do who, what, when, where, why, how, write those, and then write some blanks for you to do your gist summary. And you also have the passage that I'm going to read, but since some of you don't have this available, I'm going to read it out loud for you and then give you a few minutes to write your own who, what, when, where, why, how, and then your gist summary. This is about Mary Shelley and Frankenstein. Hardly anyone today knows who Mary Wollstonecraft Shelley was, but everyone knows about her famous creation, for she made Frankenstein. Of course, Mary Shelley didn't actually build the monster. She wrote the novel Frankenstein, the story of the mysterious doctor who made the huge man monster in his laboratory. Mary was born in 1797 in England. Her father was a famous philosopher, and her mother, who died when Mary was young, was an early believer in women's rights. Most girls at that time received very little education, but Mary learned by listening to her father and his many educated visitors. One of her father's visitors was Percy Shelley, a famous poet. When Mary was just 16 years old, she fell in love with Percy. Several years later, they were married. Notice that I haven't really talked about the creation of Frankenstein, which the title is The Lady Who Created Frankenstein. So my gist hasn't really begun in earnest yet. Okay, here we go. When Mary was 20 years old, she and Percy went on a summer vacation to the country with some friends. The weather was too cold and rainy for them to be outdoors, so the Shelleys and their guests decided to have a ghost story writing contest to pass the time. After a few days, everyone had a story but Mary. She tried again and again to write, but ended up throwing all of her attempts away. She was about to give up, but then one night she had a dream. In her dream, she saw a terrible face staring at her through the darkness, a face that was not quite human. It seemed to be put together in pieces, and it could not speak. The creature seemed to be running away through the fog, looking for help. The nightmare was so frightening that Mary awoke terrified. The next day, Mary sat down and wrote the story that later became Frankenstein. This is not just another horror story, because Mary's monster is not really evil or bad. He is just a victim of people's hatred and prejudice. Mary's husband and friends declared her story the winner of the contest and persuaded her to publish it. Although she wrote many other novels, none of them became as famous as the one about the terrible monster that she had seen in her dream. Okay, so in your template, if you have it in your handouts or on a sheet of paper, let's do a who, a what, a where, a when, a why, and a how, and put together a gist. Let's take just a few minutes to do that. Doing the gist is probably going to take longer than we have here because time is just flying by. I'm probably not giving you enough time to do this, but we need to move ahead. So you can come back to this. They're in your handouts. Come back to it and revisit this later. In your handouts, I've shared with you my attempt at a gist template. For the who, I've written Mary Shelley. For the what, I wrote the horror story Frankenstein. Where, in England. When, on a summer vacation. Didn't give us the date. Why, for a story writing contest. And how, after she had a nightmare about a monster. I took those ideas and I wrote them, and I used a 20-word gist. Mary Shelley wrote the story Frankenstein on a summer vacation in England for a writing contest after having a nightmare. Okay, that's my gist in 20 words. The main idea, the summary statement for this article. Like I said, you can vary the text, you can vary the number of words used, but this is a strategy I've used with many of my students, and they really like it. And they, in fact, will say sometimes, can we do a gist? Even when it's not in your lesson plan. So this works really well for informational text. Oh, I've lost my place. Okay. Now, let's move on to talking about narrative text. Since narrative text is generally organized around a problem solution format, the somebody wanted but so then organizer is a wonderful tool for organizing this kind of text and then for being able to summarize. To model this, begin with a story with which students are very familiar, such as Little Red Riding Hood. And so your somebody could be Little Red Riding Hood. Your wanted could be wanted to visit her grandmother. Your but could be, but she obeyed her mother, left the path and met a sly, hungry wolf. Your so could be, so the wolf threatened to eat her and her grandmother. And your then is, then the hunter saved them and killed the wolf. And this handout, this example is in your handout. Okay, so now why don't you take a few minutes and write a somebody wanted but so then statement on Cinderella. So in the Cinderella story, all of you should be familiar with that. Who is the somebody? Who's the main character? What did she want? What was the problem? What did she do to solve the problem? And what happened next? Take a few minutes to do that. Okay, do you have something like this? Somebody, Cinderella, wanted to go to the ball. The but is, but her evil stepmother said no. So her fairy godmother performed magic and gave Cinderella her wish. Then Cinderella was able to attend the ball and she met the prince. And the rest is history. Okay, so if you have something like that, you're right on target. I've also included a blank somebody wanted, but so then organizer, and a decodable text from Theseus in the Minotaur, from a decodable myth from the Connected Comprehension Extension Kit. I've copied that, and you can have that to read later and practice using the somebody wanted but so then strategy. And of course, you can use this with any narrative text. Again, decodable text if your students need to do it. Again, starting out with those interactive read alouds. Read aloud and then say, okay, let's do the somebody wanted but so then. Okay. So moving on, our third comprehension strategy is the use of graphic organizers. And a lot of people kind of don't spend a lot of time on this, but research on the effects of using graphic organizers on reading comprehension, especially with children with learning disabilities, is quite compelling. There are large effect sizes for this, even in meta-analyses that researchers have done about how graphic organizers can help our struggling readers. So graphic organizers can be thought of as maps, webs, graphs, charts, frames, or clusters. Regardless of the label that you give them, graphic organizers can help the readers focus on concepts and how they are related to other concepts. Graphic organizers can help students read and understand all types of text because they provide them with a visual model for organizing their thoughts and ideas. There are many kinds of graphic organizers, from storyboards and beginning, middle, ending charts for helping students understand story structure, to Venn diagrams for helping them organize their ideas for comparing and contrasting elements in a text. And as I've said, for struggling readers, graphic organizers can be incredibly useful. As we've said before, many of these students are focused on decoding in smaller portions of the text. So by using a visual representation of the bigger ideas, students can move toward a deeper understanding of the passages that they are reading. Modeling the use of these organizers is critical, as is beginning with simple ones before moving on to more complex versions. You can scaffold graphic organizers by filling in partial parts of the organizer. You can highlight parts of the organizer. You can give students a code. You can also use a word bank and let them put in the parts of the word bank into the graphic organizer, so that gives them choices. But if you need to scaffold by doing that, by all means do so. Choosing the right type of graphic organizer for a particular purpose and for a particular group of students requires a lot of thought and perhaps preparation. Here are a few examples of graphic organizers with their specific purposes. Remember that we are always going to be using text that our students can access, ones that are appropriate to their decoding skills. So here's a list of some of the graphic organizers that we can use. Remember, we want to choose a graphic organizer that's simple, that's not visually distracting, that's straightforward, and that's appropriate for our students' skills and ability. There are many examples of these on the web. If you Google graphic organizers, you'll be looking forever. But choose judiciously, choose carefully, use a simple graphic organizer, and stick to the same kind of graphic organizer while you are teaching a particular skill. The idea of this is always to have students be able to choose their own organizer or make one up that they're comfortable with to use for being able to have a visual representation and to organize themselves both before their reading, during their reading, and after their reading. So choose carefully, give them good examples, give them one example per skill until they are comfortable with each one of those before moving on. So here's strategy number 4. Oh, only 20 minutes to get through 5 strategies. Okay. Asking questions. We all know about how important it is to ask questions. If we ask questions before reading, we will give students a purpose for their reading and focus their attention on what they are to learn. What do you know about this? What would you like to learn about this? Assess their background knowledge and provide any background knowledge they need before moving on. And this is critical. Background knowledge cannot be overemphasized in terms of comprehension. Quite a few years ago, the FCAT, the Florida end of year test, was being analyzed for which items caused the most difficulties for students. And one number kept appearing over and over and over again in 3rd grade. And so when people actually looked at why this was causing so much trouble, it was because the topic was Kwanzaa. And none of the students, or very few students, knew what Kwanzaa was. And so they didn't have the background knowledge to help them understand what they were reading. So very important to make sure that that is there. So before reading, you're going to give them a purpose and focus their attention. During their reading, you're going to help them think actively, as they read. There's that self-monitoring again. Encourage students to monitor their own comprehension. While they're reading and while they're reading, you should focus on literal questions, stopping as often as you need to, depending on your students' needs and abilities. So only the who, what, when, where, why questions while they are reading. This is where you can encourage scaffolds such as highlighting, sticky notes, and coding to help students monitor. After reading, the questions you ask help students review the content and relate what they are learning to what they already knew. And this is the time after reading to go beyond essential facts, to have students think more deeply about the material they've read. Since recall is an issue for many of our students, you want to focus on that element first. And as I said in one of our discussions, if students don't remember what they have read, it's very difficult for them to engage in inferential thinking or about the passage or the text. So there are kinds of questions that you can ask before reading, during reading, and after reading. Whoops. Okay. How can you help your students be able to answer questions more effectively? How many times have you seen the word model? But yes, model, think aloud, to demonstrate the kind of thinking involved, especially in the inferential and critical thinking questions. Provide scaffolding and temporary support to help students answer more difficult questions. And it's also really good to help them have an understanding of the whole question and answer relationship. This is the QAR strategy, the question answer relationship strategy that was developed by Raphael in 1986, and it provides teachers and students with a shared language to think about different kinds of questions. Students learn that some questions can be answered with information that's directly in the text. Some questions require making connections between parts of the text. Some questions require incorporating your background knowledge into the text. So there's a QAR graphic organizer in your handout, and if you want to explore that more thoroughly, you certainly can. When you're thinking about asking questions, think about Bloom's taxonomy and Webb's depth of knowledge, so that your questions can not just deal with the literal level of questions. You want students to be able to inference. You want them to be able to evaluate. You want your questions to incorporate learned vocabulary. So if you've been reading a passage and the word sinister came up in your passage, one of your questions should be, why do you think this character is sinister? You want to incorporate the vocabulary that students are learning into your questions. You want to be able to ask them to go back and use text evidence to support. This is really difficult for some of our students, but it's required in many of our state standards, and it's also really helpful so that students know that they don't have to guess, that the evidence they need is there. And you also need to make sure that you increase the difficulty of both oral and written responses. For written responses, sentence frames are so helpful for being able to answer questions. Many students can answer a question in writing with 1 or 2 words, but if you ask them to answer in a complete sentence, they really struggle. So giving them sentence frames, how do you answer a why question? How do you answer a how question? Giving them the words that they need and letting them just fill in the blanks to come up with a complete sentence is really helpful. So here's some examples of the 3 kinds of thinking that we talked about when we were talking about comprehension. And so there are 3 levels of questions. So a literal question from Little Red Riding Hood, Whom did Little Red Riding Hood's mother send her to meet? Inferential, do you think Little Red Riding Hood will make it to her grandmother's house safely? Why or why not? Support your answer with sentences from the story. This is, of course, before they finish reading. And then at the end, evaluative. Do you think it was right for Little Red Riding Hood's mother to send her off into the woods? Why or why not? Support with answers from your story. So again, using interactive read alouds to ask these kinds of questions is a really great way to move forward with this. The evaluative questions are really difficult for many of our struggling readers. And I thought about this for a long time, and working with my students, I realized that when you ask your dyslexic student or struggling readers to state an opinion, these kids often are so afraid of being wrong that they don't want to take that chance. They're not risk takers. So it's really important to understand that as you're asking them questions that require their opinion, to make them feel that it's safe for them to offer an opinion. If you just stick to literal questions, those are going to be the only kinds of questions that students are ever able to answer. So you need to make sure that you're moving beyond those literal questions in your interactive read aloud, in your think alouds, and in your practice, so that you're incorporating those two other levels of comprehension. Okay, here's our fifth metacognitive strategy. And I have to admit that I did not focus as much on students generating their own questions as I was starting to teach. I wasn't really aware of the importance of this, but as I started reading more and more, looking at more and more research, I realized that this was really important. And as I started doing this more with my students, having them generate their own questions, I saw not only did their engagement and motivation increase, but their comprehension also increase. And this ties back to self-monitoring, to thinking about what they're reading, to thinking about what questions they still have. So asking their own questions keeps students more focused. By generating questions, they become aware of whether or not they can answer the questions and if they understand what they're reading. So there's back to self-monitoring. Students learn to ask themselves questions that require them to combine information from different segments of text. So you can teach students how to ask main idea questions. And as I said, this makes a huge difference in terms of motivation and engagement when students are responsible for first asking questions before they start to read, and then continuing to ask questions while they are reading. To help students answer their own questions, you first need to teach students how to ask each kind of question for the right purpose. So you can begin with who, what, when, where questions. Students have already had hopefully practice answering your questions that focus on these words. Now they're going to be asking their own questions. You're going to provide corrective feedback as they're generating, and as they are writing questions, provide them with question stems and other scaffolding as they need them. Struggling readers may also benefit from the use of sticky notes. We've talked about this before. The teacher can place a sticky note with a question word next to a targeted sentence or paragraph. So here's a good place to ask yourself a who question. Here's a good place to ask yourself a why question. And that's really helpful in order to get this strategy going. Here is something from the Connect to Comprehension program and the way that I've approached this, and this is all the way through the program. So before reading, you ask students to think of words, of questions that start with who, what, when, where, and later why. And then you're going to write those on a teaching chart, refer to them, give students a set of sticky notes, encourage them to place a note in the text when they find the answer to their questions. Then go back at the end of a chapter, at the end of a passage, see if they have answered their questions and what additional questions they have, and continue to write those on the chart. We want to always make sure to come back to students' questions, because this is not just the act of asking questions, but it also involves being able to answer your own questions, which lead you to asking more questions. Okay, identifying story structure has a lot of research evidence in terms of being important for comprehension. In story structure instruction, students learn to identify the categories of content, such as characters, setting, events, problem, and resolution. And students can learn to recognize these through story maps. And if you give them instruction in using story maps, this is really helpful for narrative text. Students also need to be taught the structure of different types of reading material. For example, narrative texts, again, have a problem, a high point of action, have a resolution, but informational text may describe, compare or contrast, present a sequence, or be structured around a problem solution or a cause and effect. In your handouts, you're going to find a very useful chart showing the 5 types of informational text structure and the signal words that students can target to determine the text structure. And again, this graphic organizer that you have will be a great anchor chart to use. We want to teach, when we're teaching informational text structure, we want to teach one structure at a time. The best way to do this is to start with description, which is easier. Give students multiple examples of this text type, okay? Then use a single subject and ask them to either tell or write a short informational passage that focuses on description. So go through all of those steps one by one as you go through the 5 different kinds of text structure. Then give students a topic, or they can choose their own topic, again, such as pets, and ask them to write 5 brief passages using the 5 different text structure. This will be after you've dealt with each one at a time and given them plenty of examples. This is something that takes a lot of time, but it is well worth it. We know from the research that being able to know the text structure prepares students for reading the text, focuses them on the right information, and helps them predict what kinds of questions are going to be asked. Okay, before we get to the home stretch, here are the 5 different kinds of text structure. Here is part of the anchor chart that you're going to have in your handout so that you can use this. Now, before we go to the home stretch and we talk about background knowledge, Frank, any questions? We're going to run over by a few minutes. I hope you all can stay with us. Frank, do we have any questions we should stop to talk about, or should we keep moving?
I think we can keep moving. There are questions, but I think that we can address them when you're finished.
Okay, so we'll move on. Okay, here's strategy 7. We've already talked about how important background knowledge is. When we read, we automatically use our own personal experience and what we had previously learned to make the written text more personal and meaningful. Students with dyslexia or other struggling readers may have a problem connecting their own prior knowledge to written information. They may be lacking in this knowledge due to an overall lack of reading. We know that poor readers read less, they read simpler text, they don't have the amount of background knowledge through reading that their more fluent peers have. You can help activate prior knowledge by pre-teaching vocabulary, providing the background knowledge that students need, and create activities to continue building this background knowledge. But that's really important. Remember my Kwanzaa story. Almost all of you are familiar, I think, with a KWL chart, which is a way to assess students' prior knowledge of the topic, as well as to activate this knowledge and to monitor learning. So in the K step or the no step, you're initiating discussions with students about what they already know. You can start with a brainstorming procedure and ask students to provide information about where or how they learned the information, and then help them organize their brainstormed ideas into categories. So they're making a mind map. For the want to learn step, discuss with students what they want to learn and ask them to write down specific questions in which they're interested. And you can do the writing and keep these posted on a class chart. For the what I learned step, ask students to write down what they learned from reading and ask them to check the questions they had generated in the what to learn step. So that's a brief description of the KWL chart. A lot of teachers use it. A lot of teachers really like it. I'm going to present you with an alternative. I really like using the anticipation guide as opposed to the KWL. And the anticipation guide really encourages self-monitoring during reading, as students look for statements that the teacher has generated and decide if they want to alter their initial opinions. Here is an example of the anticipation guide. You have a blank one in your handouts, but here's my example. So we're going to be reading about dinosaurs. And I've generated 4 statements about dinosaurs. Before students read, in that far left column, they are going to agree or disagree. And of course, you can do this out loud to help students with the reading part. And then, as they are reading or after they are reading, they can either keep their same agree or disagree or change it and then cite where they found the answer to that statement, whether it agreed with what the teacher said or they disagree with what the teacher said. This is great to do in a small group, and students really like it. It helps them focus a lot more. Rather than having to write their own statements, you've written the statements for them, and you can do as many of these or as few of them as you like. It requires more time than the KWL chart, but it's, I think, well worth the time, the anticipation guide. Oh, look, we're at number 8. One of the real important ones. I would put this number 2 after self-monitoring, but it's number 8 here. Okay. Generating mental images has been shown by many researchers to be an effective strategy for comprehending text. For many fluent readers, visualizing is automatic. As they are reading, they have a streaming video of images running through their minds. Don't you do this as a fluent reader? You're reading and you're picturing the characters and all of that. Okay, for other readers, visualization may be more strategic. They may carefully construct visual or other sensory images to support certain questions. But this skill, whether it's strategic or just general, is not automatic. Many of our struggling readers do not use this strategy at all. And I've seen this happen over and over again. Before I start doing this with students, I always ask them, what do you see when you read that? What did you see as you were reading? And they will give me a very quizzical look and say, I don't know. So they haven't been taught what we may do automatically. So our struggling readers need to be taught this skill. You can introduce this process of visualizing in tiny, small steps. First, ask students to close their eyes and form a picture of a familiar object, such as their pet dog. Then ask them to think about and visualize how this thing, object, pet, looks, sounds, feels, and smells. And then, very important, ask them to verbalize what they saw as they closed their eyes and made that mental image. Be positive and supportive as they are sharing. Next, read a sentence with descriptive words aloud to students. Have them close their eyes, have them make mental images, and then verbalize. And if they want to open their eyes, they can draw. Many students who have difficulty verbalizing do a lot better if you ask them to draw as you're reading. So the soft furry puppy with the short stubby tail jumped on my lap and fell asleep. Draw what you are seeing as you hear this. Close your eyes and picture what you are seeing as you read this, and then tell me what your description is. Okay, so you can introduce this very gradually. Once students get the idea that they can make a picture from what they are reading or what they are hearing, it's for many a real aha moment. Okay, we're going to practice this visualizing and verbalizing strategy. So on a piece of paper that you have, draw 3 clouds. I'm going to read 3 sentences to you, a 3-sentence paragraph. I want you to draw what you are visualizing in each cloud. So here's the first sentence. Some spiders go fishing when they get hungry. Draw your first picture. What does your spider look like? What color is he? What is he doing? Some spiders go fishing when they get hungry. So verbalize to yourself what that first picture is saying to you. Here's your next sentence. The fisher spider climbs down plant stems into the water. The fisher spider climbs down plant stems into the water. Draw your second picture. Remember to connect this image to your first one so that you're going to have a movie when you finish. What do those words make you picture and draw? What does the plant look like? What part of the plant is the spider climbing down? What did the spider do when he got down the plant stem? Here's your third cloud. The spider injects its powerful poison into the fish and drags it up on land where it is eaten. The spider injects its powerful poison into the fish and drags it up on land where it is eaten. Draw your third picture. What did those words make you visualize? Now, I bet if I asked you, you could go back and give me a summary of what I read to you by using your picture. And that's how visualizing and verbalizing starts. I've included some short paragraphs in your handouts that you can use to help your students with this process. Again, this is such an aha moment for many students. And sometimes after students have learned this, when you ask them, they will say, let me tell you what's in my mind movie. Here's an example from Connect to Comprehension. You can go back and look at that. We're going to move on because we're late. Okay. After learning about these Big 8 comprehension strategies, teachers can benefit by knowing when to use each strategy during the pre, during, and post-reading phases. So given the, wait, I'm in the wrong place here. Sorry. I've lost my script. So before reading, you're going to give them the purpose, preview the pages, review previously read material, activate prior knowledge, teach the meaning of the new vocabulary. If you need to, teach decoding of the vocabulary, and then frame prediction questions. So think about which strategies you are using during that. You may be referring to a graphic organizer. You may be asking questions. You may be asking students to generate their own questions. You may be referring to the structure of the passage that they're going to be reading. You'll be reviewing prior knowledge, strategy 7. So you're going to use all of those strategies in the beginning reading. You may be introducing the graphic organizer as well. During reading, you're going to be asking, remember, literal comprehension. If they're reading silently, you can use sticky notes to help them self-monitor. You can help them analyze complex sentences. You can integrate all the things that you talked about during pre-reading. You can refer to prediction. You can use the metacognitive strategies we've talked about. You can use visualization as a multisensory approach. So during reading, you're using certainly self-monitoring, you're summarizing in parts, you're referring to your graphic organizer, you're asking questions while they read, you're asking them to think about their generated questions, you're reinforcing the idea of text structure, and certainly while students are reading, you are encouraging them to use visualizing and verbalizing. So see how the strategies can be incorporated into all of these steps as you're reading. Now, after reading, you're going to do these things, and you're going to be summarizing, completing your graphic organizer, asking more questions. This will be higher level questions, referring to students' generated questions to answer those and see if they have any additional ones that they can research and find out more about. And you're going to refer to the visualizing and verbalizing they've done as a multisensory approach. Okay, so let's look at what we started with and your ratings, and you might want to re-rate yourself and be able to make sure that you can now, can you list all 8 strategies we talked about? Can you list 3 or 4? Do you know specific ways to teach these strategies? And what additional questions do you have about each one? So thank you so much for your time and attention. I know this was long. We're still going to have our question and answer session. I want to let you know about some links. Here's my email. Feel free to contact me. I love to have discussions about comprehension and everything about reading. If you want to learn more about the Connect to Comprehension Reading Intervention Program that uses these strategies, and is for dyslexic students and struggling readers, there's the website. There are also professional development courses, including virtual training for Connect to Comprehension, but also courses on vocabulary, courses on the 5 components of reading, courses on fluency. So you can take a look there and see if there's something that you're interested in. And then if you want to, would love for you to join our YouTube channel where you can see conversations that I've had with teachers about the Connect to Comprehension program and just about reading in general. So invite you to explore all of those. Thank you so much. Now let's do your questions.
All right.
Your references? Okay.
I just had a question for you, Lynn. How do you feel about allowing participants to raise their hands if they have a question and they can actually ask them themselves?
Sure.
Okay.
Why not? Be good to see some faces.
Yeah,
I feel like I'm in outer space here, so I'd love to see some.
Yeah, so if you have a question,
that would be great.
Go ahead and raise your hand. In the meantime, a question that has been posed a couple times in the Q&A is there a recommended scope and sequence for teaching comprehension skills like there is for maybe like phonics instruction?
No, but as not that I'm aware of one that really works. Some of the core reading programs give you that, but they don't make a lot of sense to me. I would always remember that you want to start with literal comprehension first and then build in those other levels. But in terms of a scope and sequence, one that really makes sense to me, not that I'm aware of.
Also, for anybody who's still participating, the chat is now active. If you'd like to interact in the chat, and if you'd like to raise your hand if you've got a question, you're welcome to do that. Let's go back to the Q&A here and see. We have one here for, is there a connection between visualizing for comprehension and executive functioning?
Yes, there is. And I think that visualizing can really help with executive functioning, because you're using a different part of your brain. You're activating you're activating your brain in different ways. So yes, it can, and it can really help with students who struggle with executive functioning.
Okay, how about let's see, that one. We've got what is your recommendation on how many times teachers model a strategy before shared practice and then again before independent practice?
As many times as it takes. Really, it just totally depends on the skill levels of your students. Just like with everything else in teaching, I always told my beginning teachers, write your lesson plans in pencil, because you never know how long something is going to take. So you model, and then as you model, you're asking questions, you're looking at students' responses, you're listening to their responses. And then once you determine that that step has been mastered pretty well, then you can begin to have students work on this skill. But you just model as many times as you need to.
Was it Anna Gillingham who said you teach as quickly as you can, but as slowly?
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yes. And that's so true. Real words of wisdom.
Judy, do you want to chime in? Oh, wait, we do have somebody with a question.
Okay, good.
Lauren, hang on, let me you are allowed to talk. You can unmute yourself.
Can you hear me?
Yes, Lauren, we hear you.
Hi,
wonderful.
Lauren.
Hi, thank
Hi.
you so much. Sorry, I have a little one. Thank you so much. I really have learned. I feel like I know how to teach them how to decode. Sorry, but this is really helpful with comprehension, because sometimes I feel like I don't have explicit ways to teach that, and I feel like that this really helped me. I was wondering, I have a
Good.
student who is really he with inferencing, he like he uses a text, but then he uses a lot of his own knowledge, and I keep trying to get him, well, go back to the text. Does what you're saying and what you think makes sense with the text, because it has to align with the text? And he just like goes off like, well, yeah, because this could have been this. Like we've been working on it for like a couple weeks, and I'm trying to I have three different inferencing passages we do just at the beginning of the lesson, and sometimes he's on it and sometimes he's not, but I don't know how to like rein him in and get him to like stop coming up with these crazy. It's like when he inferences, he's like, well, it can be what I think. Like, I don't know. Do you have any tips specifically for inferencing?
Focusing on the text evidence, underline the passage that lets you think that. When I've had students struggling with inferencing, I have gone back to pictures. Because that somehow seems to open the door for some students. I have a favorite picture of a cat sitting down at the bottom of a bird cage. The bird cage is empty. There's a feather floating down from the bird cage. And what inferences can you make? And then there's an open window. What inferences can you make from this picture? No, you can't tell what that is from the picture. So reining them in, look at the picture and point exactly to what led you to. So sometimes going back to pictures can be helpful. You might try that.
Okay, that's a great idea. Thank you so much. I'm gonna try
Sure.
that.
I'm going to just pop in here. There were a couple questions related to struggling readers who have intellectual disabilities or autism, or they're on the spectrum. And would you recommend these same strategies for those students?
Yes, I would. It's absolutely. Connected Comprehension is actually being used at a center for autism in Massachusetts, and they're affiliated with the Harvard School of Medicine. So I'm real excited about that. But yes, it absolutely, the problem sometimes is getting students, of course, to be able to verbalize. That's always an issue. But the most important thing, I think, in working with those students is engaging them, finding a way to engage them. And I think if you use some of these strategies and scaffolding, that as soon as they become more engaged, they're much more able to respond. But that engagement piece is a difficulty sometimes. But yes, I would recommend them all.
I would like to say good strategies are good strategies, right?
Absolutely, Judy.
Whether
Absolutely.
it's phonics or, phonemic awareness or comprehension.
Yes.
Somebody asked about a listening comprehension assessment. I don't know if you have any suggestions, but just off the top of my head, I would say you can use any informal reading inventory and
Yes.
use some of those passages as listening.
Yes.
You read it to them. And I always like to say that one of the strategies I like to use is if a child's listening comprehension is much higher than their reading comprehension, you may think that it is related to dyslexia because they can answer those questions. They have that knowledge base and the comprehension skills, but if they can't decode it, it's not a true listening comprehension issue, it's a decoding issue.
Exactly. That's a real red flag when you see a real difference in the reading comprehension. And listen, that's always when my antenna goes up. Yeah, it's a really good point, Judy. Thank you.
Thank you.
We have Leslie. You can unmute yourself.
I have a question about your training. Can you talk about it some more, what it involves more than what we just heard about today?
My personal training or the
No, I'm sorry, the training that you wrote. I apologize.
Oh, okay. Well, the comprehend, you mean, are you talking about on the Center for Literacy Learning?
Yes.
Okay, so the virtual training for Connected Comprehension is if you have that program and it teaches you how to implement that program. So that's very different from what we talked about today. The 8 essential strategies on that website is pretty much what I've talked about today. So that course is what you got for free today. But the course on vocabulary is really exciting to me because it teaches you how to connect words that students already know to words that they are learning. And that's a really powerful thing. If you have teachers who need a foundation for reading, those 5 components of reading, going back to the National Reading Panel and research, I think is very important. And a lot of teachers who are asking for help with a foundation, I'm recommending that course. But the virtual training for Connected Comprehension is a step-by-step approach to how do I look through the materials? How do I know what to do? It's a scripted program, but you also need the training. Does that help? I'm not sure I understood what your question was.
Well, I was looking for the C2C training. That's what I'm trying to talk
about.
Okay.
That is totally different from what today was about comprehension. That you can use with any program. The C2C virtual training is if you have the program and you want to be trained to implement with fidelity and confidence, that's what you would need.
Okay, so are they there? You can buy it but not be trained and just kind of wing it on your own, or you can?
Yes, you absolutely can do that.
Okay,
it's not what I recommend. It's not what I recommend, but yes, you can. It's scripted, and so you can. But the training is very helpful.
Okay, and how long does the training take? Or
it's about there's 6 sessions, and each is about an hour long.
Okay. Thank you very much.
Sure.
I also wanted to add, there are a couple questions about graphic organizers,
Mhm.
Sister Mary Bosco, and others about assessment. I wanted to mention what you mentioned before, Lynn. I know there's the core assessment book, which has a lot of assessments for all the different areas of reading, including comprehension. And then there's this book, if
Oh.
everybody can see it.
The
I love
best
this
in
book.
the world. The
I
best
use
in the
this for
world.
all the classes I teach as
Me
well.
too.
And
Me
this
too.
is the Teaching Reading Source Book by
Oh,
Core.
yes.
And it's really a lot, but it's very teacher friendly. And there are just tons of graphic organizers, and it's all connected to assessment and instruction. So if this is something you're not familiar with, and the reason I'm saying it, because you did mention it, Lynn, I feel comfortable saying it, but it is one of the better books out there, I think, for providing information, assessment, and actual activities, strategies for all the areas of reading. So maybe, Frank, can you put that in?
Thank you, Judy.
welcome.
Whenever teachers ask me, what's the one book that you would recommend to get me started? That's what I say. I used it, Judy, as well with all my courses at FSU. From the very beginning, Foundations of Reading, we got into it in more and more depth as we went through the semesters. But absolutely, thank you so much. Oh, yes,
And thank
absolutely.
you for supporting
You all
that.
don't have that, buy it.
A new question was, you recommended using a graphic organizer with one skill until students are capable. Could you give us an example of several skills with just one graphic organizer?
I don't think I was clear in my statement. What I meant was, let's say we're learning about comparing and contrasting. For that, we're going to use a Venn diagram. And that's the graphic organizer that we will use for comparing and contrasting. Later on, when students are reading, they will determine what they need to know and what graphic organizer to use. That doesn't answer the question, but I'm one graphic organizer per skill. And then flexibility in which to choose. And as students get more comfortable, they can come up with their own kinds of graphic organizers.
Let's see. How do you support students who are really struggling to paraphrase? For example, when I ask them to restate what they just read, they'll just read from the text. When I ask them to put it in their own words instead of reading it directly, they struggle to do so.
How much have you modeled? How many times have you modeled? I think that's the key for paraphrasing. The other thing that you can do is come up with your own paraphrasing statement and do sort of like sentence stems. Write your paraphrase statement and leave out specific words, sort of like a close procedure, and then have students fill that in. And then use fewer and fewer words that you filled in and more that they need to fill in. So walking back a little bit, providing them more of a model in terms of being able to paraphrase.
How do we build vocabulary, especially when a student has limited exposure to English language? I have ESL learners who come in with limited oral language skills.
Well, then you're focused on tier 1 words, on those everyday words that students need to learn, and you must teach those tier 1 words before you move on to teaching tier 2 words. One of the other books that I recommend all the time, Judy, on my list is Bringing Words to Life by Isabel Beck and her colleagues. Yeah, that really changed the way I thought about vocabulary. It's focused on tier 2 words, but you can also use it for tier 1 words. And it's about not just knowing the word, but being able to use it in different contexts. So I just say, focus on the tier 1 words that students don't know, gradually build in the tier 2 words, and don't assume for our ESL students that they know a word until they can show you that they know it. I think I think sometimes we make too many assumptions with our English language learners and assume that they know more than they do. And so be very careful of that. When you're thinking they don't understand a passage, it may not have as much to do with their comprehension as it does has with their lack of vocabulary.
I want to second the Bringing Words to Life book. One of the most important things I learned from Isabel Beck is a lot of teachers don't use student-friendly definitions.
Mhm.
And that, I think, is such an important thing, is to not use, not to rely on dictionary definitions, because they can often be opaque and difficult they're more difficult to understand than
the word.
Yes. So
Yes.
if you're using if you're teaching vocabulary, please use student-friendly definitions. Sorry, that's just my 2 cents.
I agree totally. And talking about graphic organizers, there are some great ones for vocabulary too. I know this is not the focus of this session. Some that include a student-friendly definition, a picture, a synonym, an antonym, use the word in a sentence. And I think when we look at those words deeply, it really does affect comprehension. So we can't just assume that our students know what all those words mean. So I'm so glad we're all on the right page.
Yes, we are. Oh, we are.
It happens to be the right page, I think.
This was not necessarily asked, but I wanted to one of the things that you were talking about in your presentation, I was wondering, I find that teaching in grammar, basically specifically the function of a noun and the subject and a predicate, is also really helpful for that sentence level understanding. To what degree do you use grammar instruction in helping students comprehend text?
Well, my students at FSU called me the grammar nerd because I was so involved in grammar. To me, understanding the structure of a sentence is critical. And to understand the structure of a sentence, you need to understand the parts of speech. You need to understand the 6 noun functions, and so on and so on and so on. I would love to go back to diagramming sentences because I did that with my dyslexic students at Skank, and it was really, really helpful. And plus they loved it, but we're not supposed to do that anymore. So, okay.
But I agree with you. And to me, it seems to be a different type of graphic organizer because it is very.
Yes, that's exactly what it is. Yes.
Right.
But I think grammar is critical. I think that's something that we've left out of teaching. I worked with Orton Gillingham Online Academy to publish a resource called Developing Essential Grammar Skills. If you go onto the Orton Gillingham Online Academy, you can find it there. And it goes all the way through the steps that you need to help students understand parts of speech, mechanics, everything connected with grammar, and then how to use those in expanding and combining sentences. So it's sort of a writing program as well. But yes, absolutely, as much grammar as you can fit into your day, the better off all of your students will be.
I'm just going to give a little shout out to Margie Gillis and Nancy Everhart. They have a series through Literacy How, and syntax happens to be one of their very teacher-friendly resources. So I know as a teacher, I always try to get everything that's out there that I can use with my students. And I love this series. There's one, for the different areas of reading, but this one on syntax is really good because I find it's a gap. And a lot of teachers don't know how to teach the grammar, the sentence structure, and so forth. And like everything else, it's going to affect that essence and goal of reading, which is comprehension. So all these things I think are so important.
Yes. I'm trying to teach myself Spanish again as an older person, and I'm using Duolingo, and I'm the thing I have the most trouble with is word order and how to how to construct a sentence with words in the right order so that they mean what they're supposed to mean. And our kids have the same difficulty. So we need to help them with that.
Judy, can you tell me the name of that book again so I can post it in the chat?
Sure. It's the Literacy How Professional Learning Series.
And who's the author?
It's Margie Gillis and Nancy Chappell Eberhardt. It's on Amazon. It's not from a particular company. And I think there's 4 different books now. There is one on comprehension and written expression, phonemic awareness, phonics and spelling. I mean, there's a whole bunch, but if they just look at the Literacy House series, and they're very reasonably priced, in my opinion. It's just another resource that connects with what we're all about. And we know Margie Gillis is an outstanding
yes, she is.
presenter, author, researcher.
Yes, thank you. I don't have that, but I'm going to buy it today.
I just posted the link in the chat.
Thank you.
Okay.
Yeah, and I put in the chat also that core book is now available through Brooks Publishing, which is one of my favorite publishing companies. So you can get it through Core or through Brooks, and they do have other resources that go along with it.
Jennifer asked, are there any decodable readers in addition to High Noon that you would recommend?
Well, the Geode series is pretty good. Flyleaf is pretty good. But my favorites are the High Noon for 2 reasons. For 3 reasons. Well, for 4. Well, I'll say for 3 reasons. One is that they're totally decodable. There's a list of high frequency words at the back of every book. And except for those high frequency words, all the other books, if you're in level A, all the other words are CVC words. The second reason is that those books do something that no other decodable reader I've seen does as well, and that is provide the reading matter to deal with those upper levels of comprehension. They use figurative language, they use idioms, they use lots of cause and effect and compare and contrast. So you can teach these skills so well using those High Noon readers. That's what Connect to Comprehension does. I found the best decodable readers I could find, and that's what I use. So that's what I recommend. But Flyleaf is good. Like I said, Geodes is good. Do you all have others that you like?
I love Flyleaf. I use that a lot in my classes too, but I am familiar with High Noon and they're great too. I used to use those for the old, a little bit older students. So I'm a little out of touch with them because I've been out of the classroom for a bit. So, but I have used them and I know they're great.
They do, like I said, they are, to me, they are unique. And so those are what I always recommend to people to use those.
They're my favorites too.
Good. Same page.
Any other questions before I do my little closing?
They are to Nancy. They are above in the chat. I will post the link again. Just find it. Okay.
And be sure if you've got my email. If you want to ask Frank or Judy something, just send it to me and I'll get it to them.
Yep. And if you need me, so my email is the email that you got on your invitation or when you registered. So you can send me any questions and we'll get those to the right person.
Yeah, and I'm just going to put my FIU email there. That's one is just easier for me to access on a daily basis. But I also have one through our IDA Florida branch website. Wow, somebody is here from Denmark. Thank you for joining. Oh my goodness,
wow.
That's great. So did you want to say anything else, Lynn or Frank, or may I?
No, I just want to thank everybody. I want to thank Judy and Frank for supporting me in this effort. And just thank you all for joining us. And I hope that you've learned a lot and that that this will be usable for you as you work with your students. So thank you. I've enjoyed it.
Oh, one last thing. I want anybody who's still online, save the date. October 8th and 9th, our annual conference is going to be in. Oh, were you going to say that already?
I'm going to say that. I'll say it. I'll give
Okay,
them.
I'll be quiet.
That's okay. No, that's okay, Frank. That's okay. It helps to hear it more than once. So I'm just sitting here, like really fascinated and thrilled. So I want to send out a really big thank you to Lynn for this outstanding session, and to each of our participants. I know the last time I looked, we were up to 214 live. So that was great. So I want to thank each of you for your time today, for your attendance. We hope you enjoyed it as much as we did. If you have any questions that weren't answered, as Lynn said, you can send her a direct email or Frank or myself, and we'll be happy to answer as best we can. Again, please be on the lookout for messages regarding our other webinars coming up monthly. And again, as Frank started to say, our first in-person conference since COVID will be October 7th and 8th, 2022 in Orlando, the Florida Hotel and what is it called? Florida Hotel and Conference Center, I believe. So we'll be sending that information soon regarding registration. We're really looking forward to that. We're going to have some great speakers. Marianne Wolf, #1, will be presenting, but remotely, and some other really great presenters, sponsors, and so forth. So we'd love to see you there. Next month, May 14th, we're going to have Jennifer Hasser from Kendor Learning speaking about vocabulary. We're trying to get all those essential elements, covered. And then we also want you to save the date for June 11th, when Nancy Hennessy will be here and continue the conversation about comprehension. So she's going to launch our book study. So on June 11th, she'll be presenting on chapters 1, 2, and 3. If you don't have her book, Blueprint for Reading Comprehension, I don't know, Frank, if you want to put that in there, it is available through Brooks Publishing, and they are offering a discount. So I believe all that is on the website, but if you don't have that book and you want to order it, you can put in the discount code and you can get it free, start reading it, and be ready for our book study. So then we're going to have Wednesday evenings in June, July, and August as follow-ups. So if you want to write this down, chapter 4 is going to be on June 29th, every 2 weeks. July 13th, chapters 5 and 6, July 27th, chapters 7 and 8, and the wrap-up and chapter 9 on August 3rd. So we will be having more information on our website. So please think about joining us for that book study, which we're really looking forward to. And I see, oh, wow, I'm just glancing at the chat while I'm going over this. We have people from all over. I'm so thrilled, so happy. So I just want to say thank you again to everybody. Have a wonderful weekend. Happy Easter, a beautiful spring season. And again, keep in touch with us. We'd love to see you every month and again in October in person. Take care.
Thank you all.
Thank you. Just last question. What's the book for the book study? Nancy Hennessy is the author. Blueprint for Reading Success. Does not look like the link is on our website yet, so I will make sure that happens. That'll be up this week, or I can't find it. And then we will be sending out invitations to join the book study. It'll be available via Zoom. You'll be on our mailing list for anybody who attended this webinar.
Perfect.
All right.
Thank you,
everyone.
Once
Stay
again.
safe.
Bye.
Thank you so much,
Bye.
Lynn. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Great
Thanks, Lynn.
presentation.
Bye-bye.